In April 1999, on what seemed like an ordinary morning on Avon Avenue in Atlanta, a discovery no one was prepared to face ripped through the calm. In a discarded trash bag, a worker saw something that made him immediately call the police. A portion of a human body that had been bleached to the point of being almost unrecognizable. "We need the forensics team here right away." The voice crackled over the radio, tense and decisive. What began as an unusual trash discovery quickly turned into a horrifying mystery as more body parts continued to be found, dismembered and scattered, as if someone was trying to erase all traces of a person from the world. But behind those trash bags was an even more terrifying story, a 21-year-old woman who had vanished without a trace just a few months earlier, after a completely normal phone call with her family on Thanksgiving 1998. No goodbye, no signs of leaving, not a single clue. For many years, the victim's identity was buried along with the mutilated body parts, and the truth seemed to disappear in the same way. But as technology began to catch up with time, what had once been hidden started to come to light, and with it came a series of suspicions directed at the person who should have been the closest one. And every single detail you are about to hear has been verified through court records, police investigation reports, autopsy results, and prosecutorial documents presented in court. The end-of-year atmosphere enveloped the city of Atlanta, Georgia, carrying the light chill of winter and the bustling pace of the holiday season. Quiet neighborhoods lit up in the evenings. Families gathered preparing for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Everything seemed to unfold exactly as it always had, calm and familiar. In that context, the life of Melissa Patton, born September 9, 1977, was no different. She was a young woman, married with 2 small children, living with her husband Christopher Wolfenbarger in the Atlanta area at the end of 1998. To those around her, Melissa was part of that normal rhythm, a wife, a mother, a daughter who still kept in touch with her family. During Thanksgiving around late November 1998, Melissa made a call to her parents from her in-laws' house on her husband's side of the family. The conversation went just like any other, with no signs of tension or instability. She talked about plans for the upcoming Christmas, about seeing her family again, about the very ordinary things anyone might say at that time of year. Nothing in that call caused anyone to worry, but it was the last time her family heard Melissa's voice. After that call, she stopped making contact. The following days passed, at first just seeming like a delay, then gradually becoming a prolonged silence. Melissa did not appear during the end-of-year occasions, did not call, and showed no signs of continuing her daily life. Her family began to notice the absence, but still hoped there might be some reason, a delay, a temporary interruption. However, as the new year of 1999 began, that silence did not end. All attempts to reach her received no response. Not only did Melissa not answer, but her husband also provided no clear explanation. The lack of information began to make everything confusing. What really made the family realize the seriousness of the situation was when Melissa did not show up for her mother's birthday in February 1999. This was not an event she would typically miss, and her complete absence turned the worry into clear fear. The family continued trying to make contact, calling multiple times, seeking information from anyone who might know something, but none of it yielded results. No one had seen Melissa. No one had heard from her. The prolonged silence began to rule out every normal possibility. When all efforts failed, Melissa's family had no other choice. They decided to officially report to the Atlanta Police Department that Melissa Patton was missing. The case of Melissa Patton was received by the Atlanta Police Department in early 1999 and quickly documented as a missing persons file according to standard procedure. In the initial report, basic information was clearly recorded. Melissa Patton, female, 21 years old, mother of 2 small children, determined to have lost all contact after Thanksgiving in late November 1998. This was not a case of an adult leaving voluntarily while maintaining minimal contact, because for many weeks, even months afterward, there was not a single signal from Melissa, no calls, no letters, no signs of transactions or personal activity. Right from the intake stage, investigators began with the most basic step, identifying the last person to see the victim and collecting statements from the closest contacts. That person was Melissa's husband, Christopher Wolfenbarger. In the initial interview, Christopher stated that Melissa had left, but his statement lacked important details. He could not provide a specific date when Melissa left the house, offered no evidence confirming she had left voluntarily, and provided no information about where she might have gone afterward. When pressed further about the circumstances before Melissa disappeared, Christopher could not clearly describe any events that could help investigators establish a reliable timeline. This lack of precision immediately became a point to check, but at that time, it was still not enough to shift the case into a criminal investigation. Alongside taking statements, police checked the couple's previous residence in Atlanta, which was reported as the place where Melissa had lived before losing contact. However, when they arrived, investigators found neither Melissa nor Christopher. The house was unoccupied. Interviews with neighbors provided an important detail. They confirmed that the couple had moved out right after Christmas 1998. The move happened somewhat suddenly, and no one in the area knew where they had gone. No new address was left. No official notice was given to neighbors, and there were no signs that the move had been planned long in advance. When permitted to inspect inside the old house, police found no signs of a struggle, no damaged belongings, no bloodstains or any physical evidence suggesting violence had occurred there. Everything, according to the initial assessment, did not resemble a typical crime scene. However, Melissa's complete absence while her husband could not provide clear information created a large gap in the story. Another notable detail was quickly recorded in the file. There was no official report from Christopher about his wife missing before Melissa's family contacted the police. In missing persons cases involving cohabiting relatives, the failure of the person living with them to proactively report is often considered a factor to examine. But at this point, investigators still had to handle the case according to the proper procedure for a missing persons file, where criminal elements had not yet been established. Initial check steps continued, verifying personal information, checking available data sources, cross-referencing with similar reports, but no standout results emerged in this early stage. There were no witnesses confirming Melissa had left, no evidence she had moved to another location, and no signs she was living under a different identity. However, there was also no direct evidence proving she had become the victim of a crime. It was precisely this lack of information in both directions that left the case in an intermediate state, no longer simply a normal absence, but not yet identifiable as a homicide case. The initial data collected was not enough to explain why Melissa Patton had disappeared, but it was enough to compel investigators to shift to a more systematic approach, accurately reconstructing what had happened in the period from the last call during Thanksgiving in November 1998 until the family reported her missing in early 1999. Timeline reconstruction relied not only on accounts, but also had to be verified with objective data sources. The first timeline points were established quite clearly at the starting point, but the deeper into the subsequent period, the details became fragmented and unsupported. There were no records of Melissa appearing in public, no evidence of her leaving the Atlanta area, and no data confirming she continued her daily life after late November 1998. Investigators turned to financial records, hoping to find at least a small trace. But all accounts in Melissa's name showed no transactions after the end of 1998. There was no cash withdrawal activity, no card payments, no signs she had used her personal finances in the period believed to be after she left. This was a directing detail, because in most cases of adults voluntarily leaving their residence, maintaining some minimal level of financial activity is almost unavoidable. At the same time, other administrative databases were also reviewed. There were no new medical records, no information about Melissa visiting any healthcare facilities, no signs of job applications or changes in employment. Official agency recording systems showed no activity related to her after the time of disappearance. When independent data sources showed no signs of existence, attention turned back to the initial statements, especially from the husband Christopher Wolfenbarger, identified as the last person to have contact with Melissa. In the process of cross-referencing statements with the timeline being built, inconsistencies began to emerge clearly. Christopher could not provide a specific time frame for when Melissa left the house, and his answers about the circumstances before she disappeared changed depending on how questions were asked. When asked to clarify why Melissa had left, he offered explanations with no verifiable basis, no witnesses, and no supporting physical evidence. The lack of a precise time frame made the gaps in the timeline impossible to fill, and this created a serious problem in determining the sequence of events. At the same time, efforts to find independent witnesses yielded no results. No one confirmed seeing Melissa leave her residence, no one reported encountering her in public places, and there was no information suggesting she had left her familiar geographic area. In similar cases, even if an individual deliberately disappeared, indirect traces often existed, such as appearances at stores, gas stations, or public transportation. However, in this case, no reliable sightings were recorded. When these factors were placed together, a pattern began to form. Melissa had not only lost contact with her family, but seemed to have vanished from the entire system recording individual activity in society. The complete absence of signs of existence after the time of disappearance made the hypothesis of her voluntarily leaving unconvincing. A mother of 2 small children, carrying no financial traces, with no contact with family, not appearing in any records, did not fit the behavioral pattern of someone who had left voluntarily. What remained was not a clear explanation, but an increasingly large gap between what could be verified and what could not be determined. The gaps in the timeline that could not be filled with data caused the approach to shift to a broader field investigation, where every possibility regarding Melissa Patton's location had to be checked directly. Police coordinated with the family to conduct sweeps of areas related to where she lived in Atlanta, including the old neighborhood, familiar routes, and places she used to frequent before late November 1998. The search was implemented systematically, starting from the closest circles around the residence and gradually expanding to surrounding areas, in hopes of finding any physical traces that could confirm Melissa's direction of movement after she lost contact. However, right from the initial steps, a major issue appeared. No means of transportation identified as belonging to Melissa was found at the scene. No vehicle was left behind. No luggage or important personal items were discovered in the checked areas. Essential items like identification papers, clothing, or any assets that might indicate she had prepared to leave were not found. The complete absence of such evidence made determining direction of movement almost impossible. At the same time, authorities checked reports of sightings of Melissa in public, including stores, gas stations, shopping centers, and crowded areas in the city. In many missing persons cases, even if the victim tried to avoid detection, indirect sightings from residents or staff at service locations often existed. But in this case, there were no reliable reports of Melissa appearing in public after late November 1998. No security cameras captured images of her, and no witnesses confirmed seeing her in the weeks or months afterward. Investigators continued expanding the scope by directly contacting friends, acquaintances, and those who had interacted with Melissa before she disappeared. Interviews were conducted with the goal of determining whether she had shared plans to leave, any signs of stress or behavioral changes beforehand. However, everyone questioned reached the same conclusion. No one had seen Melissa after Thanksgiving 1998, and no one had received any information from her since that time. There were no signs she had contacted anyone in her known network after disappearing. When personal information sources yielded no results, police turned to checking official recording systems on a broader level. Lodging facilities in the Atlanta area and surrounding regions were contacted to verify if Melissa had registered to stay, but no records in her name were found. Hospitals and medical facilities were also checked to determine the possibility she might have had an accident or needed care without being identified, but no records matched Melissa's information. Other legal systems and public databases also showed no activity related to her. There were no applications for new documents, no legal records, no signs she had continued to exist in the administrative system after the time of disappearance. The search scope continued to expand beyond the state of Georgia, assuming Melissa might have left the area. However, there was no evidence she had moved out of state, nor any data showing she had left the United States. There were no immigration records, no interstate travel traces, and no information from other law enforcement agencies indicating she had been located elsewhere. When all data sources, physical, witness, financial, and administrative, provided no signs of Melissa's existence after November 1998, the overall picture became clearer in a disturbing way. The search, though carried out on multiple levels and scopes, yielded no specific results to determine the victim's location or status. The complete lack of traces in the search process left the investigation in a state with no specific anchor, until an unexpected discovery at the end of April 1999 opened up an entirely different direction, but also simultaneously increased the severity of the case. On April 29, 1999, at the address 858 Avon Avenue, Atlanta, a worker while on duty discovered a trash bag containing something that was not easily identifiable at first, but upon closer inspection, it was a human head. Immediately after being notified, authorities quickly secured the area and processed the scene according to forensic procedures. The discovered head was in a state of decomposition and showed signs of chemical treatment. Forensic experts determined that the surface had been bleached, a method commonly used to destroy identifying features such as skin, hair, and soft tissue, while also reducing the ability to collect DNA. The use of chemicals in this case was not random, but indicated a deliberate effort to make the victim as difficult to identify as possible. No identification papers were found with the head, no signs allowed immediate identification, and no information at the scene could link this body part to a specific individual. In the context at that time, this was viewed as a discovery of an unidentified body, and police began conducting independent investigation steps with existing missing persons files. However, the head alone was not enough to provide a complete picture of what had happened, and in the many weeks that followed, authorities continued searching for additional body parts in hopes of reconstructing the victim's entire body. More than a month later, on June 3, 1999, a new discovery was recorded in the area near Hartford Avenue, Atlanta. There, other body parts of the same victim were found, also packaged in black trash bags and discarded at separate locations. These body parts clearly showed that the body had been separated into multiple sections, and dispersing them at different locations was not a random act. The packaging in trash bags and dispersal across multiple areas indicated a systematic effort to disrupt the discovery process and complicate the reconstruction of the entire body. Even with additional parts found, one important detail remained unresolved. The victim's torso did not appear in any of the discoveries. The absence of the central part of the body not only made identification difficult, but also limited the ability to determine the cause of death, as many important traces often lie in that area. Forensic experts conducted thorough examinations of the collected body parts, but the state of decomposition combined with chemical treatment made the analysis process complex. There were no direct identifying signs such as tattoos, distinctive scars, or clear personal features that could help identify the victim. DNA samples, if any remained, were also affected by the bleaching process, reducing the ability to cross-reference with available databases at that time. Meanwhile, police faced the reality that they were investigating a serious case, but missing the most basic element, the victim's identity. With no name, no records, no direct link to any missing persons reports, the case had to be handled as an independent matter. The areas where the body parts were found were swept for additional evidence, but no traces indicated these were the original crime scenes. This showed that the discovery locations were only body disposal sites, not where the fatal act had occurred. The distance between discovery points also suggested the perpetrator had moved and had time to carry out the dispersal of the body parts, rather than acting hastily or without control. During this stage, no connection was established between the body parts and Melissa Patton's disappearance, although chronologically the two events occurred relatively close together. The lack of identity prevented investigators from linking the two files, and therefore the body discovery was handled as a separate case. The collection of multiple body parts at different locations allowed forensic experts to begin more detailed analysis to reconstruct the method of the crime and body disposal. Even though the victim's identity had not yet been determined, when the body parts were brought into the examination room, the first thing noted was that the cuts were not random. Instead, they had consistent characteristics in depth, cutting direction, and contact surface, indicating the dismemberment was carried out with a specific mechanical tool. Consistent with a reciprocating saw, a type of electric saw commonly used in construction or industry. The characteristic of this type of tool is a blade that moves back and forth with even force, creating cuts with distinctive profiles. And the marks on the bones as well as remaining tissue match that mechanism. Not stopping at identifying the tool, experts also noticed that the cuts were made with relatively high precision, with no signs of slipping or repeated misdirected cuts, which suggested the person performing it had good control of the tool and was not interrupted during the process. This was particularly important because dismembering a body is not an act that can be carried out quickly or in a state of panic. It requires time, suitable space, and a certain level of concentration, thereby suggesting that this behavior was not an impulsive reaction immediately after an unexpected event, but a calculated process. In addition to the mechanical traces, the surface condition of the head discovered earlier provided another important layer of information. The signs of chemical bleaching were clearly identified, with soft tissues altered, color changed, and natural identifying features destroyed. The use of chemicals was not only aimed at distorting the face, but also served to reduce the ability to collect surface DNA, especially under the conditions of testing technology in the late 1990s, which was more limited than today. This was not a random action, but an additional step in the chain of behavior aimed at reducing the victim's identifiability. However, the very combination of dismemberment and chemical treatment also complicated the process of determining the time of death. Forensic experts could not provide an accurate timeframe for the death because the decomposition state of the body parts was inconsistent and influenced by many factors, including environment, exposure time, and post-mortem handling. The body being sectioned and dispersed also made the analysis more difficult, as each part may have experienced different conditions before being discovered. In that context, another important factor was noted: no specific crime scene was identified. The locations where the body parts were found showed no signs of an attack, no physical evidence that the fatal act had taken place there. This reinforced the assumption that the discovery sites were only body disposal locations, and the initial criminal act had occurred at another, unidentified location. The absence of a crime scene caused investigators to lose an important source of information because crime scenes often provide the most traces about how the incident occurred, the relationship between victim and perpetrator, as well as time factors. When all these elements were synthesized, a picture began to form about how the behavior was carried out. The dismemberment using a mechanical tool performed with high precision, combined with chemical treatment and dispersal of body parts at multiple locations, did not fit with impulsive or uncontrolled behavior. The forensic conclusions did not stop at identifying the tool or the method of handling the body, but also opened a clearer perspective on the purpose behind the actions that had been carried out. When the details were placed side by side, the dismemberment process was no longer simply an action after the crime, but became an important step in concealing the crime. Breaking the body into multiple parts helped reduce the overall size, making it easier to transport without attracting attention, especially in an urban environment like Atlanta, where moving large objects could easily be noticed. The body parts were found at multiple different locations in the city, showing that the perpetrator did not simply dispose of them once, but had actively dispersed them in multiple directions. This disrupted the ability to discover the entire body at once, prolonging the process of identification and reconstruction of the body over time. When one part was found, it did not immediately lead to the discovery of the remaining parts, and each location became a separate scene, not providing enough information to connect them immediately. This dispersal also increased the workload for the investigating agency because each location needed to be handled independently with its own collection and analysis procedures. Along with the dismemberment and dispersal, the signs of bleaching on the head showed an additional processing step with a clearer objective. The face is the most visually identifying feature of a person, and destroying these features made the identification process significantly more difficult, especially in the context of identification technology in the late 1990s, which was still limited. Not stopping at distorting the face, the use of chemicals also affected the ability to collect surface DNA, reducing the chance of cross-referencing with existing databases at that time. This was a move showing that the perpetrator not only wanted to conceal the act, but also wanted to slow down the process of identifying the victim for as long as possible. When the discovery locations were thoroughly examined, one notable point was that there were no signs showing the perpetrator had left traces that could be traced back. There were no personal items, no clear fingerprints, no easily identifiable biological evidence at the disposal areas. The trash bags used were common types, with no distinctive features to trace their source. This showed that the perpetrator had minimized leaving any traces that could be followed, or had carried out the act under conditions with good control of the surrounding environment. Meanwhile, another factor also contributed to increasing the effectiveness of the concealment was the absence of a missing persons report that could be directly linked to the body in the initial stage. Although there were missing persons cases recorded around the same time, there was not enough information to immediately connect the body parts to a specific individual. This created an important gap in the investigation, because without an identity, every effort to trace the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator was delayed. The body parts existed as discrete pieces of evidence, without context, without history, and without a clear starting point to follow. When considering the entire chain of behavior, from dismemberment, use of chemicals, to dispersal at multiple locations and limiting traces, a clear pattern emerged. This was not a single act or random in nature, but a series of steps carried out with purpose, each step serving the common goal of concealing the crime and avoiding detection. Every decision, from the choice of tool, the method of handling the body, to the selection of disposal locations, showed calculation aimed at prolonging the time before the victim was identified and before any connection could be established. When the concealment pattern gradually became clearly identified, the investigation direction began to turn back to the initial starting point: the people who had direct connections with Melissa Patton before she disappeared. In cases where the victim left no traces of movement and no signs of existence after the time of disappearance, reviewing the closest relationship circle was often a necessary step to narrow the scope of suspicion. The investigators proceeded to review the entire list of people who had contact with Melissa in the final period, including family, friends, and especially the person living with her. Among them, Christopher Wolfenbarger continued to be identified as the central figure who needed to be evaluated in more detail. He was the last person known to have had contact with Melissa before she lost contact, and there were no independent witnesses confirming that she had left the house after that time. When the facts from the previous sections were placed back into the same analytical framework, Christopher's role became more prominent, not only because of the close relationship, but also because of the gaps in his statements. One of the first factors reconsidered was Christopher's behavior in the period immediately after Melissa disappeared. He did not report his wife's disappearance to the authorities, nor did he proactively contact Melissa's family to inform them of the situation. In many similar cases, the person living with the missing individual is often the first to notice the abnormality and report it, but here, that did not happen. When approached during the investigation process, Christopher could not provide clear information about the time Melissa left, and his answers did not form a consistent sequence of events. The lack of full cooperation, combined with the absence of an initial report, forced investigators to question the accuracy of this statement. In addition to the behavioral factor, the geographical location facts were also brought into the analysis. The locations where the body parts were found were all within the city of Atlanta, and when cross-referenced with information about Christopher's workplace at that time, an indirect connection began to appear. He had once worked at a facility located near the area where some of the body parts were found. Although the distance was not enough to confirm his presence at a specific time, the possibility of accessing this area without attracting attention became a factor worth considering. Investigators did not consider this direct evidence, but it contributed to forming an overall picture in which Christopher had the ability to move in the relevant areas without obstacles. Another detail from his past record was also brought into the evaluation. At his workplace, Christopher had once been suspected of being involved in taking a reciprocating saw-type tool, a type of tool with characteristics matching what was identified in the forensic analysis. Although there was no official conclusion that he had used this tool in a criminal act, the existence of a prior suspicion about accessing a tool consistent with the cuts on the body became a factor that could not be overlooked. When this detail was placed alongside the forensic conclusion about the tool used, investigators noted a match in terms of possibility, even though it could not yet be confirmed with evidence. All these factors, the victim's last known location, behavior after the disappearance, lack of clarity in statements, ability to access disposal areas, and a tool consistent with the dismemberment method began to converge on a common point. Christopher was no longer just a person connected to the victim, but became an individual who needed to be closely monitored during the investigation process. However, even though the indirect factors continued to accumulate, a core problem still existed. There was no direct evidence linking him to the discovered body. There were no biological traces, no witnesses who saw him at the disposal locations, and no physical evidence that could confirm he had carried out the dismemberment or transported the body. The suspicions focused on a specific individual could not progress further without the most important element, direct evidence that could link the behavior to the person, and in that context, the investigation began to face the clear limitations of the methods and technology available at the end of the 1990s. One of the biggest obstacles was that the identity of the victim in the 1999 body discovery case had still not been determined for a long period afterward. Although there were many stored missing persons files, there was no data sufficient to directly connect the body parts to a specific individual. The bleaching of the head, combined with the state of decomposition and the missing important parts of the body, significantly reduced the ability to identify using traditional methods. Meanwhile, DNA cross-referencing efforts also yielded no results. At that time, the DNA database had not been expanded as it is today, and sample collection also faced difficulties due to biological traces that had been affected by chemicals. No samples matched the existing records, and there was no reference source for effective cross-referencing. This caused the body parts to exist as evidence without an identity. without history, and without a starting point to follow. At the same time, the lack of direct witnesses further weakened the investigation's ability to progress. No one had witnessed the criminal act. No one had seen the transportation or disposal of the body. And there was no information from the community that could help reconstruct the sequence of events. The forensic evidence, although it provided information about how the act was carried out, could not point to the person who carried it out. What could be determined only stopped at the level of method, not identity. In those circumstances, even though Christopher Wolfenbarger was still considered the person with the closest connection and had many notable factors, the lack of direct evidence prevented the investigating agency from proceeding with prosecution. There were no biological traces of his at the body discovery locations, no physical evidence linking him to the dismemberment act, and no witnesses confirming his presence in the related situations. In the legal system, indirect factors, even if they could create suspicion, were still not sufficient to meet the standard for charging. Therefore, Christopher was not prosecuted at that time, and his role in the file remained at the level of an individual of interest in the investigation. When the main investigation directions all failed to yield results, the file began to fall into a state of stagnation. The investigators had exploited what they could from the scene, from statements, and from available data sources, but no breakthrough appeared to change the situation. Any additional efforts, if any, also did not create new information sufficient to expand the investigation direction. Gradually, the frequency of reviewing the file decreased and resources were shifted to other cases with higher chances of resolution. In the law enforcement agency's process, when a case shows no progress for a long period and has no feasible investigation directions left, it is reclassified. The file for this case was moved to cold case status, a term used to refer to unsolved cases that are still kept on file, so they can be reviewed when new information or technology becomes available. Moving to cold case did not mean the case was completely closed, but it reflected the reality that, at that time, there was not enough data to continue the investigation in the usual way. In the following years, the case showed no significant progress. No new information was added, no new evidence was discovered, and there were no changes in the status of the individuals involved that could create a turning point. The file existed in the system as a collection of facts that had not been fully connected, waiting for some element that could break the deadlock that had lasted since the late 1990s. In 2003, one of those important advances appeared when DNA analysis methods were improved and allowed processing of biological samples with degraded quality, including cases that had been affected by the environment or chemicals. The body parts collected from 1999 were brought back to the laboratory for retesting with the hope of being able to determine the identity that had previously not been possible. In this process, forensic experts extracted DNA from samples that could still be used, then cross-referenced them with potential reference sources. One of the important sources used was DNA samples from relatives, and in this case, the reference sample was taken from Melissa's father, Carl Patton. The analysis results showed a genetic match, confirming that the body parts discovered in Atlanta in 1999 belonged to Melissa Patton, who had been reported missing by her family since late 1998. This identification marked an important turning point in the file, because for the first time, the body discovery and the missing persons case were connected into a single event instead of existing as two independent files. However, this process also simultaneously revealed another complicating factor related to the victim's family. Carl Patton, who provided the reference DNA sample, was not an ordinary individual in the legal system. He had been convicted in connection with a series of murders that occurred during the period 1973 to 1977, including cases known within the framework of the murders in the Flint River area of Georgia. These charges had led to his sentencing, and he was serving time in the correctional system at the time of 2003. The coincidence of identifying Melissa's identity through the DNA of a father with a murder conviction immediately raised questions about his possible involvement in this newly clarified case. However, when investigators checked Carl Patton's incarceration history and time served, an important factor was confirmed. He had been in custody during the time Melissa disappeared in late 1998. Correctional records showed he had no ability to access the victim during that period, and therefore could not have been the person who directly carried out the act leading to Melissa's death. Based on this information, Carl Patton was removed from the list of suspects in the current case, although his criminal history was still recorded as a factor to consider in the broader context. The identification of the victim's identity not only resolved a question that had existed since 1999, but also completely changed the way the file was viewed. The previously unidentified body parts were now linked to a specific person with a history, a family, and a clear timeline. This allowed investigators to restructure the entire sequence of events from the time Melissa was last seen until her body parts were discovered. The previous facts, which had been fragmented and unconnectable, could now be placed within the same context, enabling the reevaluation of hypotheses that had been proposed in the early stage. The confirmation of Melissa Patton's identity completely changed the foundation of the file, forcing investigators to go back to the beginning with a more systematic approach, where every timeline point, every behavior, and every statement was placed back into a clear, logical sequence. Instead of working with an unidentified victim, they could now build a complete timeline based on specific information about Melissa's life before her disappearance. The important points were re-identified in more detail, starting from the call during Thanksgiving in November 1998, extending to the end-of-year period when she no longer appeared in family activities, and ending at the time her body began to be discovered in 1999. When this timeline was established with higher accuracy, it became a direct cross-referencing tool with what had been recorded in Christopher Wolfenbarger's previous statements. The investigators began comparing every detail from the time Melissa was said to have left the house to Christopher's behavior in the period afterward. The mismatches began to become clear when the facts were placed side by side within the same time system. Christopher's statement, which had already been inconsistent in the early stage, now became even harder to reconcile with the newly reconstructed timeline. He could not provide a specific time frame that matched the estimated time of death, and his explanations about Melissa leaving voluntarily were incompatible with the reality that her body had been found in the same city just a few months later. This mismatch was not only in the content of the statement, but also in the behavior. The failure to report the disappearance, the move right after Christmas 1998, and the failure to provide clear information about the new residents all were reconsidered under the new perspective, where they were no longer isolated details but became part of a chain of behavior that needed to be explained. When these factors were synthesized, the file was no longer just a collection of fragmented facts, but began to form a structure that could be analyzed. To carry this out comprehensively, the file was transferred to the unit responsible for unsolved cases, commonly called the cold case unit. These are units tasked with reviewing old files with the support of new technology and more modern analysis methods, in order to find details that may have been overlooked or could not be handled at the initial time. In this process, all evidence collected from 1999 was brought out for re-examination, including scene reports, forensic results, witness statements, and related documents. Each element was re-evaluated not only based on its content, but also based on how it interacted with other facts in the file. The indirect evidence, which previously only created suspicion, was now analyzed according to higher standards, with the goal of determining whether they could form a logical chain strong enough to support an investigative conclusion. New analysis techniques allowed investigators to re-examine small details, such as the geographical distance between the body discovery points and the workplace or residence of the individuals involved, the travel time needed to carry out the dispersal of the body, and the ability to access the tools identified in the forensic analysis. These factors, when combined with a reconstructed timeline, began to create a clearer picture of what may have happened. However, even when the indirect evidence was strengthened and reanalyzed, the biggest challenge remained converting these suspicions into evidence that could be used in the legal system. Investigators had to ensure that every conclusion was supported by verifiable data, and that the chain of reasoning contained no unexplainable gaps. Reviewing the file was not only aimed at finding new evidence but also at re-evaluating the value of what already existed. In the context of a victim who had been identified and a timeline that had been clarified, all the facts after the review process were brought into a synthetic analysis phase, where each individual element was no longer considered independently but was placed in a logical chain aimed at evaluating the possibility of Christopher Wolfenbarger's involvement in Melissa Patton's death. The first focus lay on Christopher's behavior during the key period at the end of 1998. He was the last person known to have had contact with Melissa, but could not provide a specific time frame for when she left the house. No missing persons report was submitted by him to the authorities, and Melissa's family also did not receive any proactive information from his side during the period she disappeared. Along with that was the move from the residence right after Christmas 1998, without leaving a new address, a detail that was placed back in a broader context and no longer carried a random character. These behaviors, when linked together, created a chain of responses that needed to be explained, especially since they occurred in the same period when Melissa completely lost contact. The time factor was restructured with higher accuracy based on the identified points. Melissa was confirmed by her family to have been in contact during Thanksgiving in November 1998, after which there were no signs that she continued to exist in the financial, administrative, or social system. Her body parts began to be discovered on April 29 and June 3, 1999, all within the city of Atlanta. The period between these 2 points became the focus of analysis, where every explanation had to fit with the verified facts. Christopher's statement, which had been inconsistent from the beginning, became even harder to fit with this timeline, since there was no evidence confirming that Melissa had left the area or continued her life elsewhere. There were no financial transactions, no medical records, no witnesses who saw her, all of which showed that the disappearance did not fit the voluntary model. The geographical factor was brought into the analysis to determine Christopher's level of access to the related locations. The places where the body was found were within the city of Atlanta, and information about his workplace at that time showed he could move in this area without attracting attention. The distance between the discovery points and his familiar areas was assessed as not being a significant barrier, especially in an urban context where frequent movement was not closely monitored. This did not place him directly at the disposal locations, but showed he had the ability to access those areas within a timeframe consistent with the established timeline. Another factor considered was the ability to access a tool consistent with the dismemberment method. Previous records noted that Christopher had once been suspected of being involved in taking a reciprocating saw-type tool from his workplace. Forensic analysis determined that the cuts on the body were consistent with this type of tool, and the match, in terms of possibility, was brought into the analysis chain as a supplementary factor. There was no direct evidence proving he had used that tool in the criminal act, but the existence of access to a tool consistent with the crime method increased the level of connection between him and the characteristics of the case. The indirect evidence, with each individual element not sufficient to draw a conclusion, was rearranged into a connected chain. Post-disappearance behavior, inconsistency in statements, ability to access locations and tools, along with a timeline that showed no signs of voluntary departure, all formed a model that could explain the entire sequence of the case. This chain of events did not rely on a single piece of evidence, but on the convergence of many independent factors, each reinforcing the others. The goal of this synthesis process was not to affirm the charge, but to evaluate whether the existing facts reached the necessary legal threshold to proceed to the next step. In the legal system, that standard is defined as probable cause, meaning there is sufficient reasonable basis to believe that an individual may have committed a criminal act. Based on the entire analysis, the investigators reached the conclusion that the current chain of facts, although indirect in nature, had reached a level that could form probable cause against Christopher Wolfenbarger. The decision from the prosecutor's side after reviewing the file opened the transition from the analysis phase to law enforcement action, when investigators coordinated with local forces to implement an arrest warrant for Christopher Wolfenbarger on August 6, 2024. The location was determined to be his current residence in Griffin, Georgia, an area not far from Atlanta, where he had lived for many years after leaving the old address at the end of 1998. The execution of the arrest warrant was carried out according to standard procedure, with the participation of the investigators handling the case and support forces to ensure control of the situation from the beginning. When approaching the house, police did not receive an immediate response from inside, forcing them to conduct a check and ensure that the subject did not attempt to leave the scene. After entering, they conducted a sweep of each area in the house to determine Christopher's location. Here, a notable detail was recorded. He was found hiding behind a dryer in the laundry area of the house. This behavior was viewed as an attempt to avoid direct contact with law enforcement. Although there were no signs of resistance or use of force, police quickly took control of the situation, ordered him out of the position, and carried out the necessary steps to take him into custody. The arrest process occurred without conflict, and Christopher was informed of the arrest warrant as well as his rights according to legal regulations. After being removed from the scene, he was transferred to the detention facility to complete the related procedures, including recording personal information, medical check, and preparation for the next prosecutorial steps. Information about the arrest was quickly released, attracting significant attention from the public and media, not only because of the serious nature of the case, but also because of the period of more than 25 years since Melissa Patton disappeared at the end of 1998. This was not a new case, but a file that had existed through many stages, from initial investigation, stagnation, transition to cold case, then reopened and finally leading to the arrest action. The length of this time created a special factor, because it raised the question of how old facts could be used to make a legal decision in the present. In the announcement process, the authorities confirmed that Christopher Wolfenbarger was being prosecuted in connection with Melissa Patton's death, based on what had been established in the previously strengthened investigation file. Although specific details about the evidence were not fully released at the time of the arrest, proceeding with prosecution showed that the prosecutors believed the existing facts met the necessary legal standard to bring the case to court. For those who had followed the case for a long time, this arrest marked the first time a specific individual was brought into the prosecutorial process directly related to Melissa's death. In the many years before, the case had existed without an official suspect being charged, and the suspicions only stopped at the level of investigative analysis. The event on August 6, 2024 changed that status, shifting the case from a file without a conclusion to a specific legal process. At the same time, the arrest also highlighted the role of modern investigation methods in handling long-running cases, where old facts were re-evaluated and combined in new ways to reach the threshold for action. In this context, Christopher's behavior at the time of arrest, including hiding in the house, became a detail recorded in the file, but its value was evaluated in connection with the entire chain of events that had been built previously. Taking him into custody was not the end of the investigation process, but a transition to a new stage, where the facts would be examined within the legal framework. With the participation of both the prosecution and defense, the arrest process in August 2024 moved the case into a completely different stage, where the facts collected over more than 2 decades no longer existed only in the investigation file, but were brought out for verification in court. By August 2025, Christopher Wolfenbarger's trial officially took place in Fulton County, Georgia, with the participation of prosecutors, defense attorneys, the jury, and related witnesses. In this context, the focus was no longer on building investigative hypotheses, but on checking whether what had been collected was sufficient to persuade and meet the highest legal standard in the criminal justice system, proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution began by presenting the entire chain of events they had built, based on the indirect evidence accumulated from many years of investigation. They focused on Melissa Patton's timeline from the last contact in November 1998 until her body parts were discovered in 1999, and cross-referenced it with Christopher's behavior during the same period. The prosecution emphasized that Melissa showed no signs of voluntarily leaving her life, no financial transactions, no administrative activity, no witnesses who saw her after she disappeared. These factors were used to argue that her disappearance could not be explained by ordinary hypotheses. Along with that, the prosecution presented Christopher's behavior, including the failure to report the disappearance, the move right after Christmas 1998, and the inconsistencies in his statements. These details were placed in a logical structure aimed at showing that his behavior was not consistent with a husband who did not know what had happened. Geographical factors were also brought forward, with the argument that Christopher had the ability to access the areas where the body was found, and could move within that scope without attracting attention. In addition, the prosecution mentioned the ability to access a tool consistent with the dismemberment method identified in the forensic analysis as a supplementary factor in the chain of argument. However, the entire structure was based on indirect evidence, and the prosecution had to continuously link them together to create a convincing story before the jury. In the witness presentation section, the prosecution called Melissa's relatives, including family members, to provide context about her life before the disappearance, as well as to confirm that her disappearance was inconsistent with her daily behavior. These statements helped strengthen the argument that Melissa had no clear reason to leave her family and children without contact. In addition, individuals involved in the investigation process were also summoned, including investigators and forensic experts, to explain the conclusions that had been made in the file. They presented how the body had been handled, the type of tool believed to have been used, and the limitations of the evidence due to the state of decomposition and chemical treatment. The defense, on the other hand, focused on the core weaknesses in the prosecution's file. They emphasized that there was no direct DNA evidence linking Christopher to Melissa's body, no biological traces placing him at the disposal locations, and no witnesses who had seen the criminal act. Every factor the prosecution brought forward was inferential, based on connecting indirect details rather than on direct evidence. The defense also pointed out that the long period between the event and the trial reduced the reliability of some statements and caused the loss of the ability to verify some facts. They argued that in the legal system, suspicion, no matter how reasonable, could not replace evidence, and that the lack of direct evidence created a gap that could not be filled by inference. The debate between the two sides focused on the standard of beyond reasonable doubt, meaning the level of certainty the jury must reach to render a guilty verdict. The prosecution tried to prove that the chain of indirect evidence, when combined, was strong enough to rule out other possibilities, while the defense emphasized that as long as a reasonable doubt existed, the verdict must lean in favor of the defendant. Throughout the trial process, the jury had to evaluate not only each individual piece of evidence, but also how they were connected to each other, and whether that connection was tight enough to surpass the legal standard. The opposing arguments presented in the courtroom were finally transferred to the jury, where they had to make a decision based on the highest legal standard of the criminal justice system. And after a deliberation period of approximately 2 hours, on August 22, 2025, the official verdict was announced. Christopher Wolfenbarger was found not guilty on the charges related to Melissa Patton's death. The relatively short deliberation time showed that the jury had quickly reached consensus, not because they affirmed another hypothesis about what had happened, but because they assessed that the evidence presented did not reach the necessary threshold for conviction. In the legal system, declaring a defendant not guilty does not mean confirming they are innocent in the absolute sense, but reflects that the prosecution failed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, the deciding factor lay in the absence of direct evidence. There was no DNA linking Christopher to the body, no witnesses who saw the criminal act, and no specific physical evidence placing him at the crime scene or the disposal locations. The prosecution's entire file was based on indirect evidence connected into a chain of argument, and although this chain could create strong suspicion, it was still not enough to completely rule out other possibilities according to the legal standard. The defense had taken advantage of this point to emphasize that doubt, even if grounded, could not replace evidence, and that as long as a reasonable gap existed in the chain of argument, the jury had the obligation to render a verdict in favor of the defendant. The announced verdict closed the legal trial process, ending the possibility of prosecuting Christopher Wolfenbarger for the same charge in the future, according to the principle of not trying the same offense twice. However, the end of the trial did not mean the case was completely resolved. The victim's identity had been determined, the related factors had been analyzed, but no individual had been convicted for the act leading to Melissa Patton's death. This created a special state in the legal system, where a case had a suspect, an arrest, a trial, but no conviction. For the investigation file, this verdict marked an important stopping point because the facts had been presented in court and evaluated according to the highest standard. However, in reality, the core question of the case, who was the person who caused Melissa's death, still had no answer confirmed by a court verdict. The case became a typical example of the limitations of indirect evidence in the justice system, where building a logical chain could create a convincing hypothesis, but was still not enough to surpass the beyond reasonable doubt threshold when lacking a direct, authenticating element. In that context, the Melissa Patton case was not only a story about a woman who disappeared and was found many months later in conditions that made her unrecognizable, but also a demonstration of the gap between investigation and conviction, between suspicion and proof, and between what can be inferred and what can be confirmed within the legal framework. If you want to follow more cases that have stretched across decades with unanswered truths, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.